Imagine watching the woman you love being stalked, humiliated, and assaulted, all because your own brother decided she belonged to him. And your parents? They defended him to the bitter end. If you told me last year that my brother would end up in prison for trying to destroy my fiance's life, I'd have laughed in your face. But that was before I watched him pin her against a bathroom wall. Before I heard my own mother scream that Victoria had probably asked for it. Before I realized some families are so broken, you can't ever go back. Let me take you back to the night it all started, the dinner that should have been just a polite introduction, but turned into the first chapter of a nightmare. Victoria was nervous. I could feel it in the way she kept adjusting her necklace, tucking her hair behind her ear. She wanted to make a good impression. God, she had no idea what she was walking into. The second she stepped into my parents' living room, my brother Nathan's eyes locked on her. I knew that look. I'd seen it since we were kids, hungry, entitled, like the world owed him whatever he wanted. He didn't even greet me. He practically shoved our mother aside to wrap Victoria in this suffocating hug that lingered way too long. She gave me a quick, uncertain look over his shoulder, and I felt something curdle in my gut. I should have trusted that instinct. Dinner was an absolute circus. Nathan kept finding excuses to touch her, hand on her shoulder, grazing her arm, leaning in too close to whisper these bizarre, inside jokes that made no sense. Every time I tried to steer the conversation back to something normal, he would interrupt with stories about me, stories twisted to humiliate me in front of her. He used to cry in the locker room after gym class, Nathan announced with a grin, while my parents nodded along like he was telling some harmless childhood anecdote. Victoria shot me a look that said, "Are you okay?" And I just smiled tightly, because what else was I supposed to do? I didn't know it then, but this dinner would set off a chain of events that would almost destroy us. But the worst was yet to come. After dessert, Victoria, always gracious, offered to help clean up. I was helping my father move boxes in the garage, anything to get a break from Nathan's presence, when I realized I hadn't seen her in too long. I walked back into the kitchen, and my blood went cold. Nathan had her cornered by the sink. One hand was pressed to the counter, blocking her exit. The other was gesturing animatedly as he leaned in, so close his breath stirred her hair. "You deserve someone more exciting than my boring older brother," he was saying. "Someone who knows how to make you feel alive." Victoria's eyes flicked to me the second she saw me. Relief flooded her face, but her hands were clenched into tight fists. I stepped between them. Nathan laughed, this lazy, cruel sound, and backed off like he'd done nothing wrong. My parents never said a word. To them, this was all normal. Boys will be boys, right? But Nathan wasn't done. He was only just getting started. Victoria and I left as soon as we could politely escape. She was silent on the drive back to her apartment. When I parked, she finally looked at me with tears in her eyes. "I didn't want to upset you, but he scares me," she whispered. And that was the moment I realized. If I didn't protect her, no one would. Over the next few days, things got stranger. It started with anonymous calls, just breathing, then hanging up. Then messages accusing Victoria of being frigid, of rejecting a better man. Some included details about what she'd worn to work, what time she'd left the hospital, proof someone was watching her. When she showed me the voicemails, I recognized the voices. Nathan's old friends, the ones who had always trailed after him like dogs. We tried blocking the numbers. They switched to new ones. We tried ignoring them. The calls escalated. Soon they started showing up at the hospital. Victoria would catch them watching her through the glass wall of the pediatric unit. When she walked to her car after a night shift, one of them followed her so closely she could hear his footsteps echoing off the concrete. That was the night she called me sobbing in the parking lot, too afraid to drive home. I'll never forget the sound of her crying as I sped across town, wishing I could rip Nathan's world apart with my bare hands. If you think this sounds unbelievable, just wait. It gets worse. By the time we gathered all the evidence, screenshots, voicemails, security footage, I thought, surely this will be enough. I was naive. I went to my parents' house, feeling this poisonous cocktail of dread and determination. Nathan was lounging on the couch like a king on his throne. I laid everything out, the recordings, the dates, the footage of his friends tailing Victoria. He didn't even look at it. When I finished, he met my eyes with this cold little smirk. "You really think anyone's going to believe her? Maybe she shouldn't act like such a tease if she doesn't want attention." Something inside me snapped. Before I knew it, I'd punched him in the face. He clutched his nose, howling like I'd stabbed him. My mother came screaming down the stairs. My father followed, red-faced and bellowing about how I was jealous, how I'd always been a problem. They didn't even look at the proof. My mother shrieked that Victoria had probably led him on, and my father threw me out of the house, swearing I wouldn't be welcome again until I'd apologized. That was the night I realized my family was never going to be on my side, no matter what Nathan did. I'm recording this now from Victoria's apartment, where she's finally fallen asleep after crying herself sick. Her hands still tremble when she checks her phone. And all I can think is, how do you fight a monster when everyone else insists he's the victim? What would you do if your own family staged an intervention, not to help the victim, but to protect the man who stalked her? Because that's exactly what happened to us. After the night I punched Nathan, everything escalated. Victoria and I tried to focus on gathering more evidence, documenting every call, every message. We thought going to the police would finally end it. We were so wrong. The day we walked into the precinct, Victoria's hands were shaking. She'd hardly eaten in days, the circles under her eyes a bruise-colored testament to how this was wearing her down. The officer who took our report was polite at first, until I said the name Tyler. That was Nathan's best friend, the one whose voice we'd recognized in the calls. Suddenly, the officer's expression went flat. He started talking about lack of direct evidence and whether Victoria might be misinterpreting friendly attention. He actually asked her if she was sure she hadn't encouraged the interest. Victoria stared at him, speechless. And in that moment, I understood something chilling. People like Nathan and his friends get away with this because they count on no one believing the victim. But the real betrayal was still coming, from the people who should have protected us. We left the station feeling like we'd wasted hours of our lives. That night, Victoria barely spoke. She just sat on the couch, clutching the printouts of the texts, like maybe holding them would somehow make them real to other people. The next morning, my phone blew up. It was my mother, crying hysterically. She claimed Nathan was traumatized by my attack. She said going to the police proved I was obsessed with destroying my brother. When my father called, he threatened to cut me off financially, like I still relied on them. I hadn't needed their money in years, but it told me everything about where their loyalties lay. I thought that was the worst of it. Then came the dinner invitation. My mother said they wanted to fix things as a family, that Nathan was sorry and wanted to apologize. Victoria was hesitant, but she's always believed in giving people the benefit of the doubt. And honestly, I wanted to believe it too. I was tired of fighting, tired of watching her suffer, tired of feeling like we were alone. So we agreed. I will regret that decision for the rest of my life. When we arrived, I knew instantly something was wrong. There were too many cars in the driveway, too many voices inside. I opened the door, and it felt like stepping into an ambush. My parents, Nathan, my aunt and uncle, who'd always fawned over Nathan like he was some golden child, and worst of all, Tyler and two of the other men who'd been stalking Victoria at work. My mom called it an intervention. For 2 hours, they took turns tearing Victoria apart. My mother said Victoria had probably been flattered by Nathan's attention, but then felt guilty, so she'd invented a narrative about harassment. My aunt insisted Victoria was too pretty not to attract harmless interest. Nathan sat there, pretending to look hurt and confused, like he couldn't imagine why Victoria would accuse him. Every so often, he'd sniff dramatically and say he'd only ever wanted to be her friend. When Victoria tried to speak, my father raised his hand to silence her. It was surreal, like watching strangers pick apart the person you love most in the world while you were tied to a chair. And then they crossed a line I can never forgive. Tyler, Nathan's smug little lapdog, started reciting what Victoria wore on specific nights she worked late. Dates, times, even which doors she'd used to leave the hospital. It was proof they'd been stalking her, but my mother seized on it as evidence against her. If she really felt threatened, why didn't she report it right away? Why not change her schedule? Maybe she liked the attention. Victoria went pale. She tried to get up, but my aunt blocked her. My father gestured toward Tyler and his friends, saying they were good boys from respectable families, and that Victoria needed to stop making such a scene. I looked at Nathan, expecting even he might have the decency to look ashamed. He was smirking. When I finally stood up, my mother grabbed my arm. Her nails dug into my skin. "You need to choose," she hissed. "Your real family or this girl who's trying to ruin us." Victoria was trembling so hard she couldn't speak. I wrapped an arm around her and said the words I'd been dreading and needing to say. "I choose her." We walked out. My mother's voice followed us down the hall, shrill and furious. "You're dead to us." I wish I could tell you that was the end of it, but Nathan wasn't finished. The harassment only escalated. They started spreading rumors at Victoria's workplace that she was unstable, that she had a history of false accusations. One of the nurses told her she'd overheard a patient's family whispering about the crazy girl who cries rape. Her supervisor was sympathetic, but he warned her the disruption was affecting morale. By then, Victoria had lost 10 pounds. She couldn't eat without nausea. She woke up every night from nightmares of Nathan pinning her to the kitchen counter. One morning, she looked at me across the breakfast table, her eyes red and exhausted. "I can't keep doing this," she whispered. "I feel like I'm drowning." That was when we realized we couldn't stay, not if we wanted to survive. We hired a lawyer to start the process of restraining orders, but it was slow, painfully slow. Nathan's connections, our parents' money, the good old boy network, they all worked together to protect him. Victoria began looking for jobs in other cities, somewhere we could disappear, somewhere Nathan's shadow wouldn't reach us. A colleague in a pediatric unit 300 miles away offered her a position. She didn't want to go. She loved her patients, her team, but she loved her sanity more. And me? I would have followed her to the ends of the earth if it meant she'd feel safe. If you think this story couldn't get worse, just wait. Because the night my brother ended up in handcuffs was the same night he tried to assault my fiancée in front of half our family. After the so-called intervention, Victoria and I decided to start over. We packed our things, filed restraining orders, and prepared to move 300 miles away. But before we could leave, my cousin Hannah invited us to her wedding. Hannah was the only person in my family who'd ever really seen Nathan for who he was. Years earlier, she'd caught him torturing her cat behind my grandparents' shed. She tried to tell the adults. My parents convinced everyone she was lying for attention. She never forgot. So when she called to say she'd only invited Nathan because her parents insisted, and that she'd hired extra security just in case, I wanted to believe we'd be safe. Victoria was hesitant. But she also wanted closure, maybe even a final chance to prove to herself we weren't running because we were weak. I wish I'd told her no. The ceremony itself was beautiful. Hannah looked radiant, and for a few hours, Victoria almost seemed like her old self again, laughing, relaxed. I'd almost convinced myself this nightmare was finally behind us. But monsters don't just disappear. They wait for you to let your guard down. The reception started at sunset. Nathan was seated at the family table with my parents. We were across the hall with Hannah's husband's family. For the first couple hours, it almost felt normal. Then Victoria got up to use the restroom. She'd been gone about 10 minutes when I realized Nathan was no longer at his table. I don't know why, but every hair on my arm stood on end. I stood and scanned the room, and my chest went tight when I didn't see him anywhere. I started walking toward the hallway that led to the bathrooms. That's when I heard Victoria scream. I bolted around the corner. Hannah's husband and his brother were already there, pushing Nathan off Victoria. He'd pinned her against the wall outside the bathroom, one hand over her mouth, the other gripping her arm so hard it left bruises instantly. Her dress was torn at the shoulder. She was shaking, gasping for air. Nathan stumbled back, red-faced and drunk. She was flirting with me, he slurred. She followed me out here. Ask anyone. She wanted this. Hannah's husband's brother is a cop in another city. He pulled out his phone and calmly called the local police while Hannah's husband helped Victoria into a private side room. I stood there staring at Nathan, this man I'd once called my brother, and felt something inside me go cold. And then my parents arrived and proved beyond any doubt whose side they were on. They came running when they heard the shouting. My mother took one look at Victoria, her dress torn, her face streaked with tears, and turned on me. What did you do to your brother? She screamed. Before I could answer, she whirled on Victoria. I knew you'd do this. You let him on, didn't you? You couldn't handle a little harmless attention. My father tried to physically block the officers when they arrived. He planted himself in front of Nathan, arms spread wide. You're not arresting my son over a misunderstanding, he bellowed. One of the officers calmly told him to move. When he didn't, they threatened to arrest him, too. Nathan was sobbing by then, a huge theatrical wails. I loved her, he screamed. She made me crazy. He looked at me, eyes wild, and hissed, this is your fault. I will never forget what he screamed as they dragged him away. The officers finally managed to get Nathan in handcuffs. As they walked him to the squad car, he twisted around and shrieked. She's a whore. She's been begging for it since the first night we met. Half the wedding guests were recording on their phones. My mother tried to follow the police, shrieking that they were destroying her family. My father turned to me and said, voice shaking with rage, if you don't get her to drop the charges, you're no son of mine. I looked at him, this man I'd spent years trying to please, and realized I felt nothing. Victoria was sitting in the private room, clutching Hannah's hand. The torn strap of her dress hung down her arm like an accusation. When she saw me, she started sobbing all over again. I knelt in front of her and promised we'd never have to see any of them again. And I meant it. The aftermath was a hurricane. My parents called everyone in the family to spread their version of events, that Victoria had lured Nathan away, then screamed assault when he came to his senses. They claimed Hannah's husband's brother had roughed Nathan up before police arrived. They said Victoria had given herself the bruises. But this time, it didn't work. Hannah's wedding videographer had caught Nathan following Victoria toward the bathrooms on camera. Multiple guests submitted statements describing how he'd been staring at her all night. And the footage of him screaming obscenities while in handcuffs was impossible to spin. We had enough evidence to press charges, and this time, no amount of family money was going to bury it. Victoria and I went home that night and started packing in earnest. The next morning, she called the new hospital and accepted the job offer. A week later, we signed a lease 300 miles away. My father kept calling, alternating between threats and tearful pleas. My mother left me voicemails accusing me of destroying the family. I blocked every number. But just when we thought it was over, one more revelation was waiting, a final betrayal I never saw coming. For years later, I thought I was finally free, until the day my mother called me sobbing and everything I tried to warn them about came true. After the wedding, Victoria and I left everything behind. We moved 300 miles away to a city where no one knew our names. We got a little apartment with creaky floors and too much morning light, and for the first time in months, we could sleep through the night without checking the locks 3 times. It felt like freedom. Victoria started her new job in the pediatric ward. I worked remotely in software development. We made new friends who didn't know the word Nathan. Some people called it running away, but sometimes survival looks a lot like running, and I have no shame about that. For a while, it felt like we'd finally closed the book on that part of our lives. Nathan pled guilty to aggravated assault. My father spent the next year waging a PR campaign, telling anyone who'd listened that Victoria had destroyed his son. My mother left me voicemails that swung between begging for forgiveness and blaming us for tearing the family apart. I never answered. Victoria and I built something better. We got engaged on a foggy November morning. We married in a tiny ceremony with only her family and my cousin Hannah there to witness it. No drama, no screaming, just love. For 4 years, it was quiet. Until last week, when my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail. When I played it back, I heard my mother's voice. She was crying so hard I almost didn't understand her. He did it again, she kept sobbing. I don't know what to do. I should have deleted it. I should have walked away. But curiosity, maybe some leftover sliver of loyalty, made me call her back. Her voice was raw, shredded. She told me Nathan had gotten married to a woman named Rachel, a sweet, quiet girl he'd met at church. They'd only been married a year. A year that ended last week, when Rachel stopped showing up to work. When the police did a welfare check, they found her with 2 broken ribs, a fractured wrist, and bruises all over her body. I sat there in stunned silence while my mother confessed that my father had been helping Nathan cover it all up, threatening Rachel's family, using his real estate connections to scare her into staying silent. When she got a promotion that would have given her financial independence, Nathan beat her so badly she couldn't get out of bed. And when she finally called my father for help, he told her to put some ice on it and remember her vows. I'd warned them. I'd begged them to see who he really was. And now another woman had nearly died. Rachel's coworker was the one who called the police. When they arrested Nathan, my father was also charged with witness intimidation and conspiracy. My mother was hysterical. She kept saying, "You have to come home. We have to fix this as a family." I felt something break inside me. I told her the truth she'd refused to hear for 30 years. I told her she created this monster, that every time she made excuses, every time she defended Nathan, she paved the way for him to hurt someone else. I reminded her of Victoria's torn dress, her shaking hands, of the way my father had blocked the police from arresting Nathan that night at Hannah's wedding. "You knew," I said, "and you chose him anyway." She started sobbing so loud I had to pull the phone away from my ear. Then I hung up, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel guilty. But even then, the fallout wasn't over. Hannah called me later to fill in the gaps. Rachel's parents were devastated. They believed every lie my father had told them about how she was unstable and manipulative. Now they were cooperating fully with prosecutors. Several other women had come forward, ex-girlfriends from Nathan's church, women he'd dated in college, all with eerily similar stories of stalking, controlling behavior, and violence. The police were building a case that could keep Nathan behind bars for decades. And my father? His real estate license was suspended. Most of his business partners cut ties overnight. You'd think that would be the end of it. But my mother wasn't done trying to rewrite history. A few weeks later, she sent me a 12-page letter. She said she was divorcing my father, that she'd started therapy, that she finally realized how enabling Nathan had destroyed all of us. She apologized for everything, covering for Nathan as a child, humiliating Victoria, trying to force us to choose family over truth. Some part of me wanted to believe it. But then I thought about what it would have been like if Victoria and I had stayed, if we'd had children, if Nathan had been allowed near them. That thought killed any flicker of sympathy I had left. Victoria and I discussed whether we'd ever let my mother meet our daughter, because yes, a few months ago, we welcomed our little girl, Emma. She's perfect. And when I look at her, I'm reminded exactly why we walked away. Because I will never let her grow up believing she has to tolerate abuse to keep the peace. Some people think family is everything, but sometimes, cutting ties is the most loving thing you can do for yourself and for the people you love. My mother is trying to rebuild her life. Maybe one day she'll earn back a sliver of trust. But my father and Nathan, they can rot in whatever prison cells they end up in. As for us, we're finally free.